So think about how you learned language. Your first word, maybe. How you started putting sentences together. It seems pretty straightforward for most of us, right? But, what about people who don't follow that path? Especially those who get labeled nonverbal.
Exactly. And that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at language acquisition for individuals often called nonverbal autistics, particularly focusing on what's known as gestalt language processing, or GLP.
And the goal here really is to challenge those, well, traditional views that are mostly based on neurotypical development. We want to uncover the richness, the complexity of these other language pathways.
And the source material we're drawing on is fantastic for this. It's deeply rooted in lived experience, but also offers a really rigorous critique of those common assumptions. It's trying to reframe the whole conversation by centering things like time, solidarity, and, crucially, communication in all its forms, even the ones we don't usually recognize.
Okay, so before we get into the specifics of GLP, let's talk about those traditional views. Where did they come from, and what's been the sort of dominant story about learning language?
Well, for a long time, the big theories were built mainly by observing neurotypical kids. You had B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist.
Yeah, stimulus response.
Right. He saw speech as basically learned behavior, stimulus, response, reinforcement. Baby says, dada, gets a smile, boom, reinforce.
And he had specific terms for different types of speech, didn't he?
Yes, his taxonomy, things like mans for requests, tax for labeling things, and that framework, it's still very influential today, especially in ABA, applied behavior analysis.
Okay, so that's the behaviorist angle. But then there was Chomsky.
Exactly. Noam Chomsky came along and said, hang on, it can't just be conditioning. Kids say things they've never heard. They figure out grammar rules way too fast. He argued for something innate, like a built-in language acquisition device.
Makes sense. It often feels like kids just soak it up.
It does. And then tied into all this was the critical period hypothesis.
The idea that there's a specific window, usually in childhood, where you have to learn language, otherwise you can't become fluent.
Precisely. That fixed window idea. Now, these theories, Skinner's, Chomsky's, the critical period, they seem to offer a kind of order, right? Predictability.
Yeah, a map for development.
But our source argues they've had, and this is a direct quote, great consequence for anyone who learns differently. They didn't just describe language. They ended up deciding who gets listened to, what counts as progress.
And you mentioned they've even been weaponized.
That's the term used. Think about the critical period idea again. It's often been used to justify rushing kids, especially autistic kids, into intensive therapies. Like there's this looming deadline, this clock ticking down.
Wow, so the problem is they assume this one-size-fits-all universal subject.
Pretty much. They set up a standard path, and anyone not on it is seen as a deviation. It pathologizes difference instead of understanding it. And that's how you end up with labels like nonverbal being applied.
Which brings us right to the lived experience. What does it actually mean, according to our source, to be labeled nonverbal?
Well, the source author is an autistic gestalt processor who was labeled nonverbal because their speech didn't show up on schedule. They were diagnosed ASD level 2 support needs, significant impairment in functional language.
Okay.
But here's the crucial point they make. Nonverbal isn't the same as nonvocal. Many autistic people who are considered nonverbal do make sounds, they vocalize, and neither term really gets at the full picture of their communication.
So how do they learn language then?
They describe learning what we typically call language, the analytic word-by-word system, almost like a second system. It was painstaking. It happened through gestalt.
Results.
But, and this is key, another system of meaning-making, what they call a semiotic, richer, multi-layered, scene-based system, was already fully active in their mind, long before analytic speech arrived.
Okay, so let's dive into that. A gestalt language processing. What makes it different? Because, like we said, most of us probably think of learning words one by one, then stringing them together.
It's fundamentally different. GLPs don't start with the little pieces, the analytic fragments like single words. They start with wholes.
Wholes? Like what?
Echoes, scripts from movies or shows, entire scenes they've experienced or witnessed. These chunks carry the emotion, the context, everything, all bundled together.
So echolalia, repeating phrases.
Yeah.
That's actually part of it, not just random repetition.
Exactly. That's the core insight. Echolalia isn't a broken step or some kind of pathology on the way to proper language.
Right.
For a GLP, it is language. It's the building block. It's a scaffolding.
The scaffolding, I like that. A way to build bridges between their internal world and expressing it outwardly.
Precisely. It's how they start connecting meaning to sound, how they begin to participate. It's foundational, not faulty.
That really flips the script on how echolalia is often viewed. And the author's own language journey is pretty incredible, isn't it? Learning multiple languages this way.
It's amazing. They learned 5 languages: English, German, Russian, Armenian, and Spanish, all through gestalts. It shows just how powerful this processing style is.
Wow. 5 languages. Can you tell us a bit about how that felt? The source mentions the lived texture of these languages for them.
Yeah, it's fascinating. German, for instance, became the language of precision, structure, accuracy, really useful for technical things, science, where you need clear, unambiguous terms.
Okay.
Russian, though, was different. It was felt in the body,
Right.
connected to things like sport, physical discipline. They mentioned sambo drills, watching Russian athletes like Alexander Karelin. It had a physical grounding.
So different languages occupy different spaces in their mind and body.
It seems so. And Armenian was tied to warmth, hospitality, the sort of lyrical quality of the language, but also grief and survival experienced through the local expat community. It was the sound of home, almost.
And Spanish.
Spanish was the pulse of Los Angeles, the everyday soundscape of the city, grounding them in their physical place. So you have this incredibly rich, multi-layered linguistic identity.
It sounds amazing, but also incredibly complex to navigate, especially when communicating in a more typically analytic language like English.
That's exactly it, and that leads to this powerful analogy the author uses: the barrels into a shot glass.
Right, tell us about that. It sounds intense.
It really captures the effort involved. Each gestalt, each script, scene, echo is like a massive 150-liter barrel. It's full of associations, context, personal history, emotion.
Okay, huge amount of meaning.
Exactly. But speaking in English often demands breaking things down into small, discrete units, the 50 cl shot glass. So communicating means trying to somehow pour the contents of these enormous barrels into this tiny glass.
Shifting and tipping.
Shifting and tipping these barrels, as they put it. Trying to translate that immense holistic meaning into these small fragments without spilling everything. It's described as laborious, consuming, exhausting.
I can only imagine. Taking a week to recover from speaking.
Yeah, the source mentions recovering for a week after just 40 hours of intense spoken interaction. So what looks like a deficit from the outside is actually this immense unseen labor of translation between fundamentally different ways of processing meaning.
It's definitely not a deficiency. It's a different mode of operating.
Completely.
So thinking about those lived experiences, you mentioned echolalia as scaffolding. The source talks about collecting phrases like charms or little spells to navigate social situations. Is there a story that illustrates this?
Oh, the Sadie Hawkins dance story is perfect and kind of funny in hindsight. The author loved to dance. So when the first girl asked them to the dance, they had a practice script ready.
Yes.
Delivered confidently. It worked.
Success.
Right. So when a second girl asked, what do? You use the script that work. Yes. And then a third girl asked.
Okay.
And again, yes. Because the echolalia logic was, this line gets the desired result, an invitation to dance, so repeat it.
But yes, to a dance usually means just one person.
Exactly. The script didn't account for the unspoken social contract, the exclusivity implied in that yes. So the night of the dance arrives, and all 3 girls are there, expecting to be their date. Disaster.
Yikes. A very literal interpretation of the script's function.
Precisely. The scaffolding got them in the social situation, but then the complexities of neurotypical social rules, the implied meanings, caused it to collapse.
That's such a clear example. And the source revisits this story later through something called retrocausality. What's that about?
Retrocausality is the idea that we reinterpret past events based on our current understanding, our present truth. So looking back at the dance story years later, after coming out as trans femme, the author saw it differently, not just as an awkward social mistake or a failure of pragmatics, but actually as a kind of fidelity to their inner self at the time, a neuroqueer femme interior. For them, the yes wasn't about romance or exclusive courtship. It was genuinely about the joy of friendship and dancing.
So the meaning of the memory actually changed.
Exactly. It shows that our personal archive of experience is not static. It evolves as we evolve. The past gets reread through the lens of the present.
That's profound. And it really highlights how much nuance can be missed, especially, I imagine, in settings like schools. How do current educational systems tend to fail GLPs?
Well, think about standardized testing. The source argues these tests mostly measure the ability to perform analytic fragments under pressure. They flatten kids into scores.
Right, they reward a specific type of quick, fragmented response.
Exactly. So a student who might be quiet verbally, but can write these incredibly deep, complex essays, or uses quotes from films as really insightful commentary or critique, they often get marks down below basic off task.
Because their communication doesn't fit the expected format.
Right. The system is basically set up to miss their kind of brilliance. It misreads their signals constantly.
Well, what happens when they are given the right kind of space? Does the source talk about that, the architecture of genius?
Yes, absolutely. There are these moments of breakthrough. A student who rarely speaks might compose this stunningly lyrical essay. Another, maybe considered low in reading, brings a manga comic strip vividly to life by reading it with distinct character voices.
Or using unconventional tools.
Yeah, like a student solving a math problem correctly, but using Lego blocks in a way the teacher didn't expect. These moments show that what's often labeled disorder is actually a different order, a unique architecture of genius that just needs the right environment to be seen.
So, for educators listening, what's the key takeaway? What needs to change?
It's about creating what the source calls liminal spaces. Classrooms where all forms of communication are valued, not just analytic speech. Teachers need to become witnesses to this nonlinear brilliance.
Recognizing the inner world, not just judging the output based on narrow criteria.
Exactly. Seeing the students for who they are and how they think, rather than constantly trying to force them onto a predetermined developmental track.
Which leads us nicely to this idea of moving beyond timelines, beyond cure thinking. Meet parents often panic about milestones, first word by 1, sentences by 3.
Those chronological milestones are treated like law. If a child deviates, panic sets in. But the source proposes we think about teleological time instead.
Teleological time, meaning?
Meaning time that's oriented towards a purpose, a goal. For autistic GLPs, language development isn't about hitting arbitrary dates on a calendar. It happens when their internal scaffolding has ripened, when it serves their purpose. It's driven from within, not by the clock.
Like a river finding its own path to the sea, not a train sticking to a schedule.
That's a great way to put it. Their developmental rhythm is internal.
And the analogy of the boy lining up toy cars really helps understand this teleological drive and also what a meltdown might really signify.
It does. For that boy, lining up the cars isn't just repetitive behavior. It's building order, making sense of the world, performing a complex internal computation. It has a purpose.
So when someone disrupts it.
Right. If a bully kicks the cars, the meltdown isn't a tantrum in the typical sense. It's the visible trace of a mind whose purpose has been violently interrupted. The system is overloaded trying to recalculate, to restore that shattered order. It's an expression of intense distress in a world that doesn't see the purpose behind the action.
It reframes meltdowns completely. Not as bad behavior, but as a system overload, of response to a profound disruption.
Exactly. And the source uses another beautiful metaphor, the fruit tree.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that one.
Well, a fruit tree unfolds in its own time, doesn't it? Some bloom early, some take years, some might mostly provide shade. A gardener doesn't rip a tree out because it's not fruiting on time, according to some chart.
Right. You tend it, you wait, you appreciate what it does offer.
Yet the source points out, autistic children are often force drilled, uprooted daily because their way of developing, their flowering, doesn't match the charts hanging on clinic walls. It's a powerful critique of how we impose external timelines.
And does the evidence actually support these rigid timelines, like the critical period for language?
Well, interestingly, the author's research found that autistic adults often hit their stride in higher education much later, most commonly between 45 and 64.
Wow, 45 to 64. That completely blows the critical period idea out of the water for complex learning.
It really does. It suggests those developmental milestones aren't necessarily missed. They might just be arranged on different structures of time. We're dealing with different temporalities, different rhythms.
So if we move away from rigid timelines and cure thinking, what's the alternative vision for communication? The source mentions a roommate metaphor.
Yes, I love this one. Communication as meeting. Think about getting a roommate from a completely different culture. It takes effort, right?
Definitely. Patience, learning.
Patience, persistence, mutual recognition. You slowly learn each other's grammars, maybe borrow some phrases, figure out gestures. You build over time a kind of shared culture of signs and meanings.
It's about adaptation and finding common ground, not forcing one person to completely adopt the other's way.
Exactly. It's about learning to live together in language differences and all.
And this might explain why many GLPs find online spaces more comfortable.
Absolutely. Online, especially with written text, social media, even memes, time stretches and compresses to our rhythm. There's time to process, to formulate, to revise. You can layer meanings, use echoes intentionally.
Less pressure for that instant analytic response.
Right. In those spaces, they can be fluent in our own temporalities. They aren't measured against the stopwatch of neurotypical spoken conversation.
So wrapping this all up, the real hope isn't some fantasy of cure, making everyone communicate the same way.
No, the source argues hope lies in the reality of solidarity. Autistic and non-autistic people learning how to communicate with each other, influencing each other, creating something richer together. A chorus, not uniformity.
And the author's own story, even struggling to get their perspective published initially, it underlines that personal stories matter. Story is data with a soul.
Beautifully put. And that final point is huge. If GLPs are actually the majority within the autistic community, not just some small subgroup, well, that changes everything, doesn't it? It forces us to fundamentally rethink what autism is, and maybe even what language itself is.
Okay, so just to quickly recap this deep dive. It seems clear that language acquisition is way more diverse than we usually think.
Definitely. The standard models just don't capture the whole picture. For many people, especially gestalt processors, communication is about translating these incredibly rich, holistic, internal experiences, gestalts, not just putting words together one by one.
So for everyone listening, maybe the invitation is to think about how this changes your perception of communication.
Yeah.
In the classroom, at work, just interacting with people day to day.
Yeah, what kinds of languages might people be speaking that we just haven't learned to recognize yet? Because they don't fit that standard expected pattern.
Which leads us to that final provocative thought. If we actually started to redefine what counts as language, if we changed how we measure it, moving beyond those rigid timelines, what kinds of brilliance, what new forms of understanding and connection might we discover all around us?
What would it really mean to listen differently, to listen beyond the stopwatch?